Welcome to Who We Remember. I'm Jamie Yuenger, the founder of Story Keep, and your host for this podcast. In each episode, I ask my guests one question. Whose life story from your own family would you most want to see documented on film? My guests share stories of both living and deceased family members, revealing the remarkable lives that have shaped their own. This show is an extension of our mission at Story Keep, where we partner with families of wealth to preserve their histories through legacy films and private podcasts. Since 2010, we've had the privilege of working with over 100 families, capturing their unique narratives for future generations. In this podcast, I speak with fascinating people, exploring the surprising histories and significant stories of their loved ones. By delving into their particular histories, we often uncover universal themes that resonate with all of us. I find that we often wait too late to capture the stories of those that we love. But through these conversations, we elevate and celebrate the enduring influence of one person's life. My hope is that you leave each episode thinking more deeply about your own story and the legacy that you want to create. Today, I'm looking forward to introducing you to Kjartan Jansen. Originally from Norway, Kjartan is the co-founder of Graddha, a wealth dynamics coaching firm, which he runs alongside his wife, Marlies. After 2 decades in finance, he now helps clients define their values and navigate the complex relational landscape of significant wealth and families. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area and is a passionate surfer, skier, and mountain biker. On this episode, Kjartan and I will be talking about his paternal grandfather, Holst Jansen. His grandfather passed away many years ago when Kjartan was young, but the story goes that his grandfather Jan was part of the Norwegian resistance during World War II, meaning his grandfather, along with many other young men, nearly 5,000 of them, fled into the Norwegian forest to evade orders to register for service under Germany during the Second World War. After the war, his grandfather was a judge. He disagreed with how many innocents were thrown in with the sympathizers and collaborators, so he quit his law practice and took over his father's furniture shop. Kjartan has been so curious about what those years in his grandfather's life were like. In fact, in preparing for this conversation, he and his father finally visited the Resistance Museum in Oslo. I've had the pleasure of knowing Kjartan and helping create some short video clips for their firm's website. I'm so delighted to share this time with him in this way. Let's dive in. Kjartan, it's so good to be with you.
It's great to be with you, Jamie.
So Pete and I were noting this sort of funny thing, which is that 2 episodes ago, we spoke with Jennifer East, and she talked about her father who joined the Royal Canadian Army and was a bomber and a bomber pilot. And then we're also with you. You're in Norway currently.
I'm in Norway currently.
And she was speaking from Malta, and that you're speaking about your paternal grandfather who was in the resistance during that same war. And so I just found that kind of interesting and wonderful that all these intersections of history and people.
Which is World War II, just to be clear. Yeah.
World War II, yes. Yeah. So, but, living out, all these lines of time and space. So it's really fascinating to have this time to talk about your grandfather. Can you share a little bit about him and why it was that he was the one from your family that you wanted to document his life story?
Yeah. Let's see. Let's start at the beginning. He was born in 1918 in Norway, a little northeast, I think, of Oslo. And pre-war, so I don't know much about his childhood, but I do know that he went to law school. I think he started in 1938. Mm-hmm. And that was obviously disrupted after a couple of years. He had, at the time, Norway didn't really have an army as such, but I think most boys did have some basic training. So he had, I think, 3 months of basic training When Germany invaded on April 9th of 1940, everyone was called out or in or whatever or everyone was mobilized. So he immediately met up with some of his friends and other people a little bit north of where they lived, and fought.
And when you say fought, what do you mean?
There was a battle where with the Germans, and from what I understand, one of his closest friends was killed in that altercation or fight or battle or whatever you will, and they were captured. So this happened very, very quickly, right? So probably April 9th or April 10th or something like that. And he spent there's so much we don't know, but some time in a camp as a I suppose prisoner of war. I'm not sure if, I mean, they were prisoners of war, but I don't think they were treated badly as far as we know, but I'm sure it was still very, very traumatic. But you may also know or remember that, Germans, they had this, I think they thought they were coming to liberate Norway, and they weren't expecting a fight. They thought, oh, this will be great. We'll come and they'll just roll over and be part of the cause. And that didn't happen. And so, but they were still very enamored by the Northern Europeans, right? And so he was released along with the surviving members of the troop or battalion or whatever who had fought. And he went home to my grandmother. They lived together. And from what I understand, continued his studies for a little while. The university was still open for a couple of years until 1942, I believe. And at the same time was part of the resistance after having fought that initial battle, that devastating battle where he lost one of his good friends. What he did or they did is not something that we really know. Very few of the resistance fighters talk about that time at all. Thinking back, it was a time when it was a long time ago now. we Norwegians aren't particularly good at talking about feelings. They were way worse back then, and so it's just not something it was something that happened, and you don't talk about it. So we have. There's so much of that history that we don't know. We don't know exactly what they did, how it felt, what the impact was, but we think that they might have participated in circulating newspapers or pamphlets or written material informing people of what was happening in the resistance, what was happening around the world, ideas about how others could resist. And so, but again, I don't know a ton of details. Nobody does about exactly what transpired. Maybe they were out, fighting from time to time. We just don't know. So I guess we'll fast forward to 1945 when the war finally ended. What I know is that he picked up where he left and finished his studies at the law school in Oslo. Like in Holland, I think. So you might need to help me here, Jamie. So there are generally two types of law. There's common law and civil law, right? I think civil law is UK and US.
Well, that's great. I feel like we're going to probably have listeners who know a lot about this.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I know that there are two, and whichever one isn't practiced in the UK and the US and the Commonwealth, I think, is practiced in most of Europe. And there's a huge difference is that it's generally, I know this because my sister's a lawyer, and I have some other lawyer friends. It's based on the law as it's written, not as it's interpreted in prior cases.
Okay.
And so, in Norway, and I assume in Holland and other countries too, we have these massive books that have all the laws in them. And so whenever there's a case, you look up the law. I hope I'm right about this. You look up the law and try to base your judgment on that. And so a lot of people right out of law school are judges. Sort of very opposite of what we're used to in the United States, where that's something you
earn and
work
grow
towards, and the Supreme Court justices are the ultimate judges. I think that's still the case here, but a lot of people right out of law school will work as judges in sort of regional places, and that's something that my grandfather did. He was a judge in the local municipality right after the war.
When he was like less than 30 years old, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, about 30 years old.
Okay.
Right? No, it would be about 30 years old. So 45, 40, 29, 30. And of course, after the war, the main focus was on the after effect of the war, people who had, and punishing people who had collaborated, who had profited from the war, et cetera, et cetera. He felt like there were a lot of people who were unfairly judged, who weren't necessarily sympathizers or collaborators, but were thrown under the bus, as it were. And there were a lot of people who clearly had, in his mind, who were in positions of power or maybe had notable names that weren't punished as they should be. And so he decided to quit after just a couple of years.
So he was disheartened by his own profession.
He was very stressed out. And this is a part that I didn't know a few weeks ago, but I since learned. So he moved over to the Department of Finance, which is a branch of the government, right? And worked there for a couple of years as a lawyer before he eventually joined his dad in his furniture business. But the part that I find super interesting about this and inspiring is, someone who clearly was a patriot, who didn't hesitate for a second to run and join his friends and others to resist when Germany invaded again in 1940, and continued to resist the entire war, was able to be intellectually honest enough with himself to look at what I can only imagine is somewhat objectively as a judge at what was happening, and say, this ain't right, and I'm not going to participate in it.
In a sense, he resisted again.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And on a higher level or a different level, a different realm.
He did. And, one of the things that we were wondering about, though, is, and we'll never know, but it's still very interesting, is how much of that is what we now call PTSD, and how much of it is resisting, if you will. And I'm guessing there's probably a combination of the two in there. we know that even generations after a big trauma, we have physical responses to what happened in the past, and things that happens in our lifetime. We certainly have physical responses to the memories of it. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and the beginning of, I forget the topic, it is not really that important. The beginning of COVID was brought up, and they played a clip from March of 2020. And when I heard the reporter talk about it, my entire body started to shiver. I wasn't expecting it, but it was like, wow, I guess I have some PTSD from that time too. We probably all do. And so that made me think what it must have been like for him to relive the trauma of those 5 years. I think it was just over 5 years. Yeah, because of the war in Norway ended in May 8th, I believe, of 1945. So April 9th, 1940 to May 8th of 1945. To not only relive those early days when one of his best friends was killed, which in and of itself is horribly traumatic, and then having lived through those 5 years of occupation and uncertainty, and having fought that, and then having to sit as a judge and think about how to mete out punishment to people who he didn't necessarily think deserved it.
Somehow I can imagine, so he later joined, some years later, he joined the family's furniture business. I'm just imagining that period, I don't know if he was actually making furniture himself, but that world where there's very, very hands-on, right? And somehow being in touch with real material items, like I can imagine that there could have been some level of reflection and peace that was really needed in his life from all of that. I don't know if that's what his story was or his experience, but in my mind, I can just imagine.
I think, well, he was very good at it. So the furniture business was his dad had a business where he represented several furniture factories. So he would be, I guess it's called a reseller these days, where he would go to various furniture stores and show them the furniture and sell it on behalf of the manufacturer. My grandfather's, his name is Holst Jansen. His dad became sick at some point and needed help, and so we think that might be, again, these are things are a little bit unclear here. He didn't talk a lot about this, but he left the Department of Finance. We're not sure if it was permanently or not, but it ended up being permanently, to help out with his dad's business. He also happened to be very, very good at making stuff. And he did a lot of the work on their house to improve and expand it. He also built a boat.
Wow.
Which was quite a beautiful wooden boat that they spent a lot of time on. It was they lived close to a river that they could take the boat up to a lake where they had a cabin. And so I think you're right. I think, that craftsmanship could very well have been a way to get away from that other side. To process some of the things that happen.
So I'm curious, like you didn't know a lot, but you had chosen your grandfather Jan as the person that you would want to document his story in film. And just imagine if we had that. But you didn't know a lot, and then you sort of learned some, it sounds like, from talking to family. Well, you've now been in Norway, you live in San Francisco, or the Bay Area. So I am curious, like, what, if you really had him in front of a camera lens, what would you want to ask him about his life, about these times that you've mentioned? What would your question be?
I think, well, quite a few. Of course, if he'd be willing to share what really transpired. You know, it took me, 90 seconds to tell maybe 2 minutes to tell the story, right? Well, these were days and weeks and years of his life. And what must that have been like to have, first of all, to experience the invasion in such a brutal way, and then lose his friend in a battle, which I hope I never experienced that. Of course, I haven't, and I'm thankful for that. And the being captured, spending time, well, really all of it, and what part, how he and my grandmother participated in the resistance, and what that was like, and what kind of purpose that gave them, how that played a part in their lives during those years, and how it, and also what does he think his life would have been like if that didn't happen?
Maybe you couldn't even imagine it, but yeah, it would be an interesting question to ask him.
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting question to ask.
Yeah. And so how old was he about when he passed away? Do you know?
He passed away in 1986. So some cool. 86 minus 18, so late 60s.
Yeah, late 60s. So he, you know, through the period of time of the war to when he became a judge, he had another 30 odd years of his life that I guess he was working in the furniture business.
He did, yeah.
For some of the majority of his life, but this critical, poignant part was in this, you know, early young adult development period of his own life.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Do you have curiosity about the furniture part of his life and that business, or because at this point in your life and in your career with your wife Marlies, you help families who are, you know, dealing with their businesses or other enterprises and kind of managing family life, and interestingly, like he was in that situation to a certain extent, right?
Yeah.
Doing business with family.
Yes. It's something else that it's another part that we know less about than we really wish we could. We do know that some of the, well, we think, we don't know anything. We think that he entered the business because he had to.
Yeah. Not an uncommon theme.
Duty. Whether he wanted to exit the job that he had, well, he'd obviously left the judging to do legal work for the Department of Finance, which I imagine is a little less stressful, but who knows? So was this something that he wanted to do, or did he have to do it and continue? And did he continue to do it out of duty? He seemed very happy to, you know, be making stuff, improving their house, building the boat, and things like that. So there's certainly this narrative that I think we have that he was happy doing it and maybe even wanted to do it, but we don't really know. We do know that towards the end, a couple of the manufacturers decided to pull out. So they became quite successful and decided that they didn't want a middleman, if you will. And so business became much more challenging. I don't know if it went belly up, or if he just decided that it wasn't worth it anymore. But at some point, the business ceased.
Okay.
Yeah. The other, well, there's so many parts here, but he, as many people of his generation, he was a very heavy smoker. My grandma, not so much. She would have a cigarette every once in a while socially, but she wasn't really a smoker. But he was a very, very heavy smoker. He ended up dying of cancer. And prior to that, he had probably, I'm pretty sure this was a cancer thing too, but he had one of his legs amputated from that. So there was some hardship towards the end there, and obviously he died pretty young, relatively speaking.
Right. So I'm struck by, I don't know how you see it, but in the times that I've been able to spend with you, which I've really enjoyed, and learning about your passions and your interests and your work. And now I learned in preparing for this that at some point you wanted to be a peace negotiator.
Right.
I think that ship has sailed, I think. But
I think so, yeah. Although there might be some...
There's lots of work to do. Yeah.
Plenty of work.
I think, you could get it, perhaps. That, I see sort of elements of your grandfather's life story and his legacy from where I sit and seeing you living out in, first of all, the way you conduct yourself and your spirit of sort of an equanimity and temperance, but also sort of, he was in the world of finance and you're certainly a numbers guy and how you help families. And then you have this like love of surfing and being, active with, your body. And he was doing that, but I guess in another way with making stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How do you perceive his values, his personality, his legacy living out through the generations and into you and maybe even into your two daughters? I don't know.
I think it's the reason I chose to talk about him when you reached out is that his story is aspirational to me. Obviously not the trauma part of it, but the standing up and doing and acting out on what he thought was right. And that's something that I think I haven't done enough of, but aspire to really do, to speak my mind. Well, I know what I stand for, and act on it.
Yeah. Is there something that is knocking at your heart currently that you would share with me, or is it something still being processed?
I think it's something. There's not one particular thing that I feel is hiding inside that I can't talk about, and I think I feel much more settled about it now than I did, say, 5 years ago. But it's something that it's just something that I've been aware of that I'd like to continue to work on. I think we all should, of course. Well, some people may not need to. They may say more than, may speak their mind more than they should. But, I've always been intrigued by his story. And the more I learn about it, the more intrigued I am by it, really. And I think it's a fascinating one, but it's also very, very complex. As I mentioned, I don't know how much of the decisions might have been trauma based. We'll never know.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Your grandmother, it sounds like you said she was in as part of the resistance as well. And
we believe so, yes.
Do you, I guess what you know of him has come through your parents' stories that they shared with you, and not with them, because he died when you were young.
He died when I was young, and she died in 98, I believe, and also never talked about it.
I never talked about it.
Yeah. And also I did, as I've been in Oslo a few days now, and my dad and I went to the Resistance Museum a few days ago to do some research.
Okay.
So I know a lot more about the resistance. There was obviously nothing about him per se there, but it was fascinating to see the story as told by the museum, and with photos and old newspaper clips and all sorts of tchotchkes.
Well, the image that we have, because we don't have an image of your grandfather to share for this episode, but we pulled an image from some of the archives of resistance, young men who are sort of representative of your grandfather. That's part of your, sort of in the header of your podcast episode page. And I guess it does sort of spark the imagination to a certain degree. I mean, it did for me when I looked at that, and then reading for myself about how thousands of young men and young women in different ways, that I guess that at least in the early days, they fled to the forests in Norway to resist being called up. And that was about ultimately 5,000 or so, but I suppose there were more as time went on. I don't know if that syncs with what you learned when you went to the museum.
No, it absolutely does. And one thing that struck me is, and I don't know if you noticed it when looking at the photos, is they are all clean shaven.
I didn't notice that.
They are.
You're like, how did we do? A gentleman tell us.
How did they do that?
Secrets.
They were living out there in the forest, but they still took time to make sure they were clean shaven.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at yourself. You.
I did shave this morning, but in fairness, I think it's a little easier for me today than it was back then.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I have sort of two final questions, and I have so many questions, but with our time, two final questions. One is, what you would have your daughters know, or what you would share with them, now that you've spent this time going to the museum and thinking about this more. Could be information, but what you would share with them maybe on a more holistic level about your grandfather and what you would want them to know. And then the final question is what you would want to say to him if you had the chance, or what you would want to ask him.
Yeah. Well, I'll certainly share with my daughters what I've learned, now that I have this new knowledge. Before coming here, I didn't even know that he had the 2 or so years in the Department of Finance after he quit being a judge. That's something that I learned from my dad before we went to the museum together. But we spent a fair bit of time where I probed him on, what he knew and what he, obviously all the things he doesn't know. So I'm eager to do that, because I know they both enjoy, as most of us do, learning about history, their family history.
Yeah.
What I think the question that comes to mind is the one that I mentioned earlier. What do you envision would have happened if this didn't happen? And one of the reasons for that is, as we all do, I have a maternal grandfather as well. He was born a little bit before my paternal grandfather. My maternal grandfather was born in 1914, so he was a few years older. He was in medical school when the war broke out and never finished. He worked in the health, I think he worked for Red Cross most of his life, if not all of his life. But he, for whatever reason, didn't go back and finish. And so for me, this question of what if is I think he could have I don't know. He's also passed. I wish I could have asked him that, but I was too young to think about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, what would, it's such a huge disruptor.
Yeah. Yeah. How would his life have been? How would he have been different?
His new life would have been different.
Yeah.
And what, yeah. And I guess the follow on to that is what would you have done differently in your life, if anything? What regrets do you have, small or big?
Yeah. I guess since we can't ask him, I guess we'll have to ask ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And luckily we still have some time left.
We do to
course correct if necessary.
Yeah, course correct if we need to. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Kjartan, I hope we have more opportunities outside of Zoom to sit and chat. But I have to say, I really appreciate this time to, I majored in Scandinavian studies. I told you that before. So I did actually take a period of time studying some of the resistance as part of my studies, but it, reverberates in such a different way, talking about your grandfather together. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Being here in Oslo, which is the city I grew up in, I didn't go to college here, but I grew up here. But it's very, very different. It's changed so much since I left. I left in the early 90s to go to college and then came to the US in 97.
Yeah.
If when you have a chance, hop up here. It's a pretty cool place now. It's worth visiting.
Okay. I studied in Bergen and was in Oslo in 2003. So that's 21 years ago.
20 years ago, yeah.
So not that long after you left.
But still, it's a very different place today.
So I look forward to it. Yeah. Probably getting a beer is still an expensive proposition, but I can handle that.
Well, most things are here.
Yeah, but I really I will. We recently learned about the Norient Express, which is this super fancy train system, which I don't know if we'll go for that, but it inspired us anew to coming to Norway. So thanks for the invitation, the prompt.
Well, lovely to be with you.
Lovely to be with you too, and we'll talk soon.
Talk soon.
Thanks.